The story begins in the glittering heart of Manhattan, where the skyline pierces the heavens and the elite walk streets paved with privilege. Beneath the surface of this dazzling city, however, lies a shadowy underworld, a realm of secrets, manipulation, and unimaginable horror. This is where Jeffrey Epstein, a man of immense wealth and influence, built his empire. To the world, he was a billionaire financier with an uncanny knack for navigating the labyrinthine corridors of power. But behind closed doors, Epstein was a predator, a man who weaponized his fortune and connections to prey on the vulnerable. Epstein's rise to prominence was as enigmatic as it was meteoric. Born into modest means in Brooklyn, he seemed destined for an ordinary life. Yet, through a combination of charm, cunning, and ruthlessness, he clawed his way into the upper echelons of society. By the 1980s, Epstein had cultivated relationships with some of the most powerful figures in politics, business, and entertainment. His sprawling network of allies included presidents and princes, billionaires and celebrities, individuals who would later find themselves ensnared in the fallout of his crimes. But Epstein's wealth wasn't merely a tool for self-aggrandizement, it was a weapon. He used his private jets to ferry guests to his secluded properties, places that would come to be known as sites of unspeakable abuse. His mansion in Manhattan became a fortress of depravity, its walls concealing the horrors that unfolded within. On his private island in the Caribbean, ominously nicknamed Pedophile Island by locals, Epstein orchestrated a web of exploitation so vast that its full scope may never be known. The story truly begins in 2005, when whispers of Epstein's predatory behavior began to surface publicly for the first time. A young girl from Palm Beach came forward with allegations that she had been lured into Epstein's orbit under false pretenses. What started as an isolated claim quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. Investigators discovered that Epstein had created a system, a pipeline, designed to recruit and groom underage girls for his personal gratification. The victims were often from disadvantaged backgrounds, their vulnerabilities exploited by promises of money or opportunities. Yet even as evidence against him mounted, Epstein's influence shielded him from meaningful consequences. In 2008, he struck a controversial plea deal that allowed him to serve just 13 months in a county jail, most of which he spent on work release outside its confines. The deal enraged advocates for justice, but underscored Epstein's ability to manipulate the system to his advantage. This is not merely a story about one man's monstrous acts. It is a tale about power, how it corrupts and protects those who wield it. It is about complicity, the enablers who turned a blind eye or actively facilitated Epstein's crimes in exchange for their own benefits. And it is about survival, the resilience of those who emerged from the darkness to demand accountability. The tone of this narrative is one of unrelenting tension and unease. As we delve deeper into Epstein's world, we confront not only the horrors he inflicted, but also the societal structures that allowed him to thrive unchecked for so long. The story seeks not only to recount events, but to evoke visceral emotions: anger at the injustices committed, sorrow for the lives shattered by Epstein's actions, and determination to ensure such atrocities are never repeated. In this introduction lies the seed of vengeance, a reckoning long overdue. For years, Epstein operated with impunity, believing himself untouchable. But no empire built on abuse can stand forever. This is a story that will explore how justice can emerge from even the darkest corners of humanity. A story where vengeance becomes not just an act, but a symbol of redemption. The year is 2005, and the gilded facade of Jeffrey Epstein's life begins to crack. It starts with a single voice, a young girl from Palm Beach, Florida, who steps forward with allegations. that seem almost too horrifying to believe. She recounts how she was lured into Epstein's mansion under the guise of earning quick money by giving him a massage. What followed was not only a violation of her trust, but an act that would shatter her innocence forever. Her bravery in speaking sets off a chain reaction as more girls begin to come forward, their stories echoing hers with chilling similarity. The Palm Beach Police Department launches an investigation, and what they uncover is nothing short of horrifying. Epstein's mansion is not merely a home, it is a machine of exploitation. The sprawling estate is meticulously designed to conceal his crimes. Surveillance cameras are discreetly placed in nearly every room, recording the movements of his guests and victims alike. Investigators discover a pattern. Girls as young as 14 are recruited by intermediaries, often other young women who had already been ensnared in Epstein's web. These recruiters are promised money or favors in exchange for bringing new victims into the fold. The victims are overwhelmingly vulnerable, girls from low-income families or troubled backgrounds who are desperate for financial stability or validation. Epstein preys on their desperation, offering them cash for massages that quickly escalate into acts of abuse. For many, the shame and fear of retaliation keep them silent. But as more victims come forward, the scope of Epstein's operation becomes impossible to ignore. Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Reiter is appalled by what his team uncovers. He assembles a case that he believes will bring Epstein to justice, compiling testimony from multiple victims and corroborating evidence from Epstein's own staff. The case is airtight, or so it seems. When Reiter hands over his findings to the state attorney's office, however, he encounters an unexpected obstacle: resistance. Epstein's legal team is formidable, comprising some of the most powerful attorneys in the country. They include Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard law professor with a reputation for defending controversial figures, and Kenneth Starr, the former independent counsel who investigated President Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Together, they wage an aggressive campaign to discredit Epstein's accusers and undermine the investigation. Behind the scenes, Epstein leverages his vast network of influence. He calls in favors from powerful friends, many of whom owe their own fortunes or reputations to him. Whispers circulate that Epstein possesses compromising information about some of these individuals, evidence gleaned from his surveillance system or his intimate knowledge of their private lives. Whether through fear or loyalty, these allies rally to his defense. Despite these obstacles, Chief Reiter refuses to back down. He takes the unprecedented step of bypassing the state attorney's office and handing the case directly to federal prosecutors. The FBI launches its own investigation into Epstein's activities, uncovering even more damning evidence. They find records of flights on Epstein's private jet, the infamous Lolita Express, that suggest he transported underage girls across state lines and internationally for illicit purposes. But even as the federal case builds momentum, cracks begin to appear in the pursuit of justice. In 2008, after months of negotiations behind closed doors, Epstein strikes a plea deal with federal prosecutors that defies comprehension. He pleads guilty to 2 state charges, procuring a minor for prostitution and soliciting prostitution. In exchange, he avoids federal charges entirely and serves just 13 months in jail, a sentence so lenient it borders on absurdity. The terms of the deal are shocking not only for their leniency, but also for their secrecy. The agreement includes a clause granting immunity to any potential co-conspirators, a move that effectively shields many of Epstein's associates from prosecution. The victims are not informed of the deal until after it is finalized, a violation of their rights under federal law. The fallout is immediate and devastating. Advocates for survivors decry the plea deal as a miscarriage of justice, while Epstein emerges from jail largely unscathed. He resumes his life as though nothing has happened, retreating to his private island and resuming his social engagements with powerful figures around the world. For years, it seems as though Epstein has escaped accountability once again, but beneath the surface a storm is brewing, a slow but relentless tide that will eventually engulf him and everyone who enabled his crimes. The survivors refuse to be silenced. They continue to share their stories, building a movement that grows louder with each passing year. The conflict deepens as journalists begin to peel back the layers of Epstein's empire. Investigative reporters, like Julie K. Brown from the Miami Herald, take up the mantle of exposing what others have tried to bury. Brown's groundbreaking reporting in 2018 reignites public outrage over Epstein's crimes and forces authorities to reopen their investigations. Epstein himself remains defiant throughout this period, convinced that his wealth and connections will protect him forever. But cracks begin to show in his carefully constructed facade. His name becomes synonymous with corruption and abuse. Former allies distance themselves from him as public scrutiny intensifies. This chapter closes with an ominous sense of foreboding. While Epstein remains free for now, forces beyond his control are aligning against him. The survivors' voices grow louder, investigators dig deeper, journalists refuse to let the story fade into obscurity. Jeffrey Epstein's life was built on relationships, carefully cultivated, meticulously maintained, and ruthlessly exploited. To the outside world, he was a man of charm and sophistication, someone who could seamlessly navigate the upper echelons of society. But beneath this polished exterior lay a manipulative predator who used his connections not only to climb the social ladder, but also to shield himself from accountability. These relationships were the lifeblood of his empire, each one serving a purpose in his grand design. Epstein's inner circle was a mosaic of enablers, accomplices, and unwitting participants. Chief among them was Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of disgraced media mogul Robert Maxwell. Ghislaine was more than just Epstein's confidant. She was his partner in crime. With her aristocratic background and impeccable social credentials, she opened doors that might otherwise have been closed to him. But her role went far beyond introductions. Survivors would later describe her as the architect of Epstein's recruitment system, a woman who groomed young girls with promises of mentorship and opportunity, only to deliver them into Epstein's hands. Their relationship was complex, shrouded in secrecy and speculation. Some believed Ghislaine acted out of love or loyalty to Epstein. Others saw her as a willing participant driven by her own ambitions. Whatever her motivations, she became an indispensable part of his operation, often acting as the public face of his private depravity. Then there were the powerful men who orbited Epstein like moths drawn to a flame. Politicians, business magnates, and celebrities frequented his lavish parties and flew on his private jet. Some were drawn by his wealth and connections, others were lured by the promise of indulgence without consequence. These relationships served a dual purpose for Epstein. They bolstered his image as a legitimate financier, while also providing him with potential leverage. The surveillance cameras in his homes were not merely for security, they were tools for gathering information that could be used to manipulate or blackmail. But not all relationships in Epstein's life were forged in power or privilege. Many were built on coercion and exploitation. The young girls he targeted often came from broken homes or lived on the margins of society. To them, Epstein appeared as a savior, a man offering money, stability, or even just attention in a world that had largely ignored them. He preyed on their vulnerabilities with calculated precision, using their trust against them. The survivors' stories reveal the depth of Epstein's manipulation. Many described how he would initially treat them with kindness, creating an illusion of safety before crossing boundaries they didn't yet understand. Some were coerced into recruiting others, a tactic that not only expanded his network, but also deepened their own feelings of guilt and complicity. For years, many carried this burden silently, believing they were alone in their experiences. Epstein's relationships extended beyond individuals to entire institutions. He donated millions to prestigious universities like Harvard, earning him not only tax benefits, but also an air of legitimacy. These donations often came with strings attached, access to influential figures, or opportunities to further entrench himself in elite circles. Even after his 2008 conviction, some institutions continued to accept his money or maintain ties with him, illustrating the corrosive power of wealth. But as Epstein's empire began to crumble under the weight of renewed investigations and public scrutiny, these relationships faced unprecedented strain. Former allies distanced themselves from him, claiming ignorance of his crimes despite years of association. Others found themselves implicated by evidence that suggested they had been more than passive bystanders. For the survivors, these dynamics added another layer of complexity to their trauma. Many struggled with feelings of betrayal, not just by Epstein, but by the adults who should have protected them and the systems that failed them at every turn. Their stories were not just about individual acts of abuse, but about a culture that prioritized power over justice. As journalists like Julie K. Brown began to expose the extent of Epstein's network, some survivors found strength in solidarity. They formed connections with one another, sharing their stories and supporting each other through legal battles and media scrutiny. For many, this newfound community became a source of healing, a way to reclaim their narratives from the man who had tried to silence them. The interpersonal dynamics surrounding Jeffrey Epstein reveal not only the depths of his depravity, but also the resilience of those who stood against him. His relationships were tools for exploitation. Theirs became weapons for survival and justice. The year 2019 marked the beginning of the end for Jeffrey Epstein. For over a decade, he had lived as though his crimes were behind him, shielded by his wealth, influence, and the silence of those who feared or benefited from his power. But the tide was turning. The survivors, once scattered and silenced, were finding their voices. Investigative journalists were unearthing truths that could no longer be ignored. And a society increasingly intolerant of abuses by the powerful was demanding accountability. What followed was a dramatic unraveling, a point of no return that would shatter Epstein's carefully constructed world. The turning point came in July 2019, when Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, upon returning from Paris aboard his private jet. The arrest was the culmination of years of investigative work, particularly by Julie K. Brown of the Miami Herald, whose explosive reporting in 2018 had reignited public outrage over Epstein's crimes and the lenient plea deal he received in 2008. Brown's series, titled Perversion of Justice, laid bare the extent of Epstein's abuse and the systemic failures that had allowed him to evade accountability. It was a damning indictment not only of Epstein, but also of the legal and social structures that had protected him. The arrest sent shockwaves through Epstein's world. Federal prosecutors in New York charged him with sex trafficking and conspiracy, alleging that he had abused dozens of underage girls at his properties in Manhattan, Palm Beach, and elsewhere. The indictment painted a grim picture of a man who had spent decades orchestrating a vast network of exploitation, using his wealth and connections to lure victims into his orbit. Epstein's arrest also marked a shift in public perception. For years, he had operated with impunity, his crimes whispered about but rarely confronted. Now he was no longer untouchable. The survivors who had come forward years earlier, only to see their cases dismissed or diminished, finally saw a glimmer. of justice on the horizon. Their courage in sharing their stories became a rallying cry for others to do the same. As Epstein sat in a federal detention center awaiting trial, the walls began to close in around him. His arrest prompted renewed scrutiny of his relationships with powerful figures, including politicians, royalty, and celebrities. Photographs and flight logs emerged, showing these individuals in Epstein's company, raising questions about what they knew and whether they had participated in or enabled his crimes. Some denied any wrongdoing, others remained conspicuously silent. The pressure on Epstein mounted as investigators uncovered more evidence against him. A search of his Manhattan mansion revealed troves of incriminating material, photographs of underage girls, detailed records of financial transactions linked to his trafficking operation, and even a fake passport bearing Epstein's photograph but issued under a different name. These discoveries painted a picture of a man who not only committed heinous acts but meticulously documented them, a chilling testament to his arrogance and belief that he was above the law. But even as the case against Epstein grew stronger, questions lingered about whether justice would truly be served. His wealth and connections had shielded him before. Could they do so again? And what about the others implicated by association? Those who had attended his parties, flown on his jet or visited his island. Would they face accountability as well? For Epstein himself, the turning point came not just in his arrest, but in what followed. His death on August 10, 2019, under circumstances that remain shrouded in mystery. Found unresponsive in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. In Manhattan, he was pronounced dead from an apparent suicide, a conclusion that sparked widespread skepticism given the high-profile nature of his case and the powerful individuals implicated by association. Epstein's death marked a dramatic climax to this chapter of the story, but left many questions unanswered. For some survivors, it felt like another betrayal, a final escape for a man who had spent his life evading accountability. For others, it was a catalyst for renewed determination to seek justice against those who had enabled or participated in his crimes. This turning point was not just about Jeffrey Epstein. It was about the broader systems that allowed him to thrive for so long. It exposed deep flaws in how society handles allegations of abuse by powerful individuals and raised urgent questions about complicity, accountability, and justice. As the dust settled on Epstein's death, one thing became clear. While he may have escaped judgment in this life, the fight for justice was far from over. The survivors' voices would not be silenced, their stories would not be forgotten, and those who had stood by as Epstein built his empire would face their own reckoning. Jeffrey Epstein's death in August 2019 was not the end of the story. For the survivors, it was a moment of profound complexity, an emotional storm of relief, anger, frustration, and grief. On one hand, the man who had inflicted so much pain was gone, unable to harm anyone else. On the other, his death robbed them of the chance to see him face justice in a courtroom, to confront him and hear him answer for his crimes. Yet, in this moment of darkness, a new chapter began, one of resilience, reckoning, and growth. The survivors, many of whom had spent years living in silence and shame, emerged as a force to be reckoned with. Their voices, once dismissed or ignored, became the driving force behind a global conversation about abuse, power dynamics, and systemic failure. They were no longer just victims. They were warriors in a battle for justice and accountability. For many survivors, overcoming began with reclaiming their narratives. Epstein had spent decades silencing his victims through intimidation, manipulation, and legal threats. Now, with his death removing one barrier to their stories being heard, they stepped forward with courage and determination. Women like Virginia Giuffre and Sarah Ransom became public faces of the movement, sharing their experiences not only to seek justice for themselves, but also to inspire others who had suffered in silence. This reclamation of voice was not without its challenges. Speaking out meant revisiting trauma, facing public scrutiny, and enduring relentless attacks from those who sought to discredit them. Epstein's defenders, and those implicated by association, fought back with lawsuits, smear campaigns, and thinly veiled threats. But the survivors refused to back down. They found strength in solidarity, forming networks of support that transcended borders and backgrounds. The legal battles that followed Epstein's death became another arena for growth and resilience. Survivors pursued civil lawsuits against his estate, seeking compensation not only for their suffering, but also as a form of symbolic justice. These lawsuits revealed the staggering scale of Epstein's wealth, a fortune built on secrecy and exploitation, and forced his estate to confront its complicity in his crimes. But these legal victories were about more than money. They were about accountability. Through depositions and court filings, survivors forced those who had enabled Epstein's crimes to answer difficult questions. Ghislaine Maxwell's arrest in July 2020 marked a significant milestone in this pursuit of accountability. As Epstein's closest confidant and alleged co-conspirator, her trial became a focal point for survivors' quest for justice. Maxwell's conviction in December 2021 on charges of sex trafficking and conspiracy was a watershed moment. For many survivors, it was a validation of their experiences, a recognition that what they had endured was real and that those responsible would face consequences. Yet even this victory was bittersweet. Maxwell's conviction brought some closure, but also underscored how many others involved in Epstein's network remained untouched by the law. Beyond the courtroom, the survivors' stories sparked broader societal change. Their courage inspired movements aimed at reforming how institutions handle allegations of abuse and exploitation. Universities that had accepted donations from Epstein faced intense scrutiny and pressure to address their complicity. Law enforcement agencies re-evaluated their handling of cases involving powerful individuals, acknowledging past failures and pledging to do better. For some survivors, overcoming meant finding ways to transform their pain into purpose. Many became advocates for change, using their platforms to raise awareness about human trafficking, sexual abuse, and systemic corruption. They spoke at conferences, collaborated with nonprofits, and worked to pass legislation aimed at protecting vulnerable populations from predators like Epstein. The process of growth was deeply personal as well as collective. Each survivor navigated their own journey toward healing, some through therapy or support groups, others through art or activism. For many, healing meant confronting not only what Epstein had done, but also the societal structures that had allowed him to thrive. The enablers who turned a blind eye, the systems that prioritized power over justice, the culture that silenced victims while protecting perpetrators. This period of growth extended beyond the survivors themselves to society at large. The revelations about Epstein's crimes forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about privilege, corruption, and complicity. His case became a symbol of how wealth can distort justice, a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked. As the survivors rebuilt their lives piece by piece, they carried with them lessons forged in pain, but tempered by hope. That silence is not an option, that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged, that justice is not always immediate, but is worth pursuing nonetheless. In this chapter of overcoming and growth lies a powerful message. While Jeffrey Epstein may have been at the center of this story initially, he does not define its ending. The survivors do. Their resilience transforms tragedy into triumph, not by erasing what happened, but by ensuring it will never be forgotten or repeated. The climax of Jeffrey Epstein's story is not a single event, but a crescendo of revelations, confrontations and consequences that reverberate far beyond his death. It is a moment when the survivor's resilience, the relentless pursuit of truth by journalists, and the growing public outrage converge to dismantle the empire of abuse Epstein spent decades building. This is the point where the weight of his crimes and the complicity of those around him come crashing down, leaving no room for denial or escape. In the wake of Epstein's death in August 2019, the world's attention turned to his enablers, those who had helped him perpetrate his crimes or turned a blind eye to his actions. Chief among them was Ghislaine Maxwell, who had long been accused of recruiting and grooming young girls for Epstein. Her arrest in July 2020 was a seismic moment in the case. For years, Maxwell had lived in relative anonymity, avoiding public scrutiny despite mounting allegations against her. But with Epstein gone, she became the focus of both legal proceedings and public outrage. Maxwell's trial in late 2021 was a dramatic and emotionally charged affair. Survivors took the stand to recount their experiences, their voices trembling with emotion but unwavering in their determination to be heard. They described how Maxwell had lured them into Epstein's orbit with promises of mentorship or financial support, only to betray their trust in the most horrific ways. Their testimony was harrowing, painting a vivid picture of Maxwell as not just an accomplice, but an active participant in Epstein's crimes. The trial also exposed the inner workings of Epstein's network. Evidence presented in court included flight logs from his private jet, photographs from his properties, and financial records that revealed payments made to victims and recruiters. These details painted a damning portrait of a system designed to exploit and silence young girls while protecting those at its center. Maxwell's defense team attempted to shift blame onto Epstein himself, arguing that she was merely a scapegoat for his actions. But the jury saw through this narrative, convicting her on 5 counts of sex trafficking and conspiracy. Maxwell's conviction was a pivotal moment, a rare instance where someone from Epstein's inner circle faced tangible consequences for their actions. For many survivors, it was a bittersweet victory. While it brought some measure of justice, it also underscored how many others involved in Epstein's network remained unaccountable. The trial raised more questions than it answered about the powerful figures who had associated with Epstein: politicians, royalty, business magnates, and celebrities whose names appeared in flight logs or photographs, but who denied any knowledge of his crimes. The climax also extended beyond Maxwell's trial to broader societal reckonings. Institutions that had accepted donations from Epstein faced intense scrutiny. Harvard University returned funds linked to him and launched internal reviews into how he had been allowed to associate with its faculty even after his 2008 conviction. Other organizations distanced themselves from individuals implicated by association with Epstein, signaling a shift in how society views complicity. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this climax was the survivors' triumph over silence and shame. For years, they had been dismissed or discredited by those who sought to protect Epstein or themselves. Now their stories were front and center, a testament to their courage and resilience. Their voices forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about power dynamics, systemic corruption, and the pervasive nature of abuse. The climax reached its emotional peak when survivors gathered outside courthouses or appeared on national television to share their reactions to Maxwell's conviction. Some wept openly. Others spoke with quiet determination about what this moment meant for them and for future generations. Their words carried a powerful message that justice is not just about punishment, but about acknowledgement, about being seen and heard. after years of invisibility. This climactic chapter also marked a turning point in how society approaches cases like Epstein's. It sparked conversations about reforming laws related to human trafficking and abuse, holding institutions accountable for enabling predators, and ensuring that survivors have access to justice, regardless of their socioeconomic status. As this chapter draws to a close, it leaves behind a sense of both resolution and unfinished business. Maxwell's conviction is a significant victory, but not the end of the fight for justice. The survivors' stories continue to inspire action and awareness, ensuring that Epstein's legacy will not be one of silence, but one of reckoning. As the dust settled following Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction, it seemed as though the long shadow of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes might finally begin to fade. But the story was far from over. In the aftermath of Maxwell's trial, new revelations and developments emerged that reignited public interest and reshaped the narrative. This was not simply a continuation, it was a new point of turning, one that shifted the focus from individual accountability to the broader systems and networks that had allowed Epstein's empire of abuse to flourish. The first tremors came with the unsealing of court documents linked to civil lawsuits filed by survivors against Epstein's estate and Maxwell. These documents contained explosive allegations implicating high-profile individuals who had long been rumored to be connected to Epstein. Names that had once been whispered in private now appeared in legal filings, forcing powerful figures to confront public scrutiny. Politicians, business titans, and even members of royalty faced questions about their relationships with Epstein and whether they had participated in or turned a blind eye to his crimes. Among those thrust into the spotlight was Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most vocal survivors, alleged that she had been trafficked to Andrew when she was just 17 years old. The prince vehemently denied the accusations, but a photograph showing him with Giuffre and Maxwell cast doubt on his claims. The scandal deepened when Andrew gave a disastrous television interview in which he attempted to defend himself, but instead raised more questions about his behavior and judgment. Public outrage mounted, and Andrew was stripped of his royal duties as he faced a civil lawsuit brought by Giuffre. In early 2022, he settled the case out of court for an undisclosed sum, a move widely seen as an attempt to avoid further embarrassment. But Prince Andrew was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Investigative journalists continued to dig into Epstein's network, uncovering new details about how he had used his wealth and connections to shield himself from accountability. Reports revealed that some of his most prominent associates had benefited from his largesse or participated in his lavish gatherings, raising uncomfortable questions about their complicity. While some claimed ignorance of Epstein's crimes, others faced mounting evidence suggesting they had been more deeply involved than they admitted. This new point of turning also brought renewed focus on the institutions that had enabled Epstein. Financial firms that managed his wealth faced lawsuits from survivors who argued that they had facilitated his trafficking operation by ignoring red flags. Universities and cultural organizations that had accepted donations from Epstein grappled with their own legacies of complicity. Some issued public apologies or pledged to use funds linked to him for survivor advocacy programs, but for many observers, these gestures felt too little, too late. Perhaps most significantly, this chapter highlighted systemic failures within law enforcement and the justice system. The controversial plea deal Epstein received in 2008 came under renewed scrutiny, with calls for accountability for those who had negotiated or approved it. Survivors demanded answers about why federal prosecutors had agreed to such lenient terms, despite overwhelming evidence of Epstein's crimes. The Department of Justice launched an internal review into the handling of the case, but its findings left many dissatisfied, as no significant consequences were imposed on those responsible. Amid these revelations, survivors continued to lead the charge for change. Their voices grew louder as they called not only for accountability, but also for prevention, advocating for reforms aimed at protecting vulnerable populations from predators like Epstein. They worked with lawmakers to draft legislation targeting human trafficking and exploitation, ensuring that future victims would have stronger protections and greater access to justice. For many survivors, this new point of turning was deeply personal as well as political. It forced them to confront lingering questions about their own experiences. How many people knew what was happening but did nothing? How could a system designed to protect them have failed so profoundly? These questions fueled their determination to ensure that no one else would have to endure what they had. This chapter also marked a shift in public perception. Where once there had been skepticism or indifference towards survivors' stories, there was now widespread acknowledgement of their courage and credibility. Movements like Me Too had already begun changing societal attitudes toward abuse and power dynamics. The Epstein case amplified this shift by exposing just how pervasive these issues were at the highest levels of society. The new point of turning culminated in a collective reckoning, not just with Jeffrey Epstein's crimes, but with the culture that allowed them to happen. It became clear that while individuals like Maxwell and Prince Andrew could be held accountable, true justice required dismantling the systems that enabled predators like Epstein in the first place. This chapter leaves us on the precipice of transformation, a moment when survivors' voices have reshaped the narrative and forced society to confront its own failures. But it also raises pressing questions. Will this reckoning lead to lasting change, or will those in power find ways to rebuild their walls of silence and complicity? The story of Jeffrey Epstein and the empire of abuse he built is one of darkness, but it is also one of reckoning. As the survivors, journalists, and advocates pushed forward, the narrative shifted from being about one man's monstrous actions to a broader examination of power, complicity, and justice. The conclusion of this harrowing saga is not tied to Epstein's death or Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction. It lies in the enduring impact of those who refused to let the truth be buried. In the years following Maxwell's sentencing and the unsealing of court documents, the survivors continued their fight for justice. They were no longer merely witnesses to Epstein's crimes. They had become agents of change. Their voices, once silenced by fear and shame, now echoed across courtrooms, legislative chambers, and media platforms. They demanded not just accountability for Epstein's enablers, but systemic reforms to prevent such abuses from happening again. The lawsuits against Epstein's estate provided some survivors with financial compensation, though no amount of money could undo the harm they had endured. These settlements served as a symbolic acknowledgement of their suffering and a step toward reclaiming their dignity. But for many survivors, the true victory was in being heard, in forcing the world to confront the truth about what they had endured and ensuring that their stories would not be forgotten. Institutions implicated in Epstein's network faced their own reckonings. Universities that had accepted his donations grappled with how to atone for their complicity. Some redirected funds linked to him towards survivor advocacy programs or research on human trafficking. Others issued public apologies, acknowledging that their pursuit of wealth and prestige had blinded them to the red flags surrounding Epstein. The legal system also underwent scrutiny. The 2008 plea deal that allowed Epstein to evade serious consequences became a case study in how wealth and influence can distort justice. Advocacy groups pushed for reforms aimed at ensuring greater transparency and accountability in prosecutorial decisions. Survivors worked with lawmakers to draft legislation targeting human trafficking and exploitation, creating stronger protections for vulnerable populations. But perhaps the most profound shift occurred in society itself. The Epstein case became a symbol of how power can corrupt and shield predators from accountability, a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond his immediate circle. It forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about privilege, complicity, and systemic failure. Movements like Me Too found renewed momentum as more survivors came forward with their own stories, inspired by the courage of those who had stood up against Epstein. For the survivors, this conclusion was not an end, but a beginning, a chance to rebuild their lives on their own terms. Some channeled their pain into activism, working tirelessly to support other survivors and advocate for change. Others found solace in private healing journeys, reconnecting with family and friends, or pursuing passions that had been overshadowed by trauma. Each survivor's path was unique, but all shared a common thread: resilience. The legacy of Jeffrey Epstein is not one of triumph, but of exposure, of shining a light on the darkest corners of society and forcing those who benefited from his crimes to face uncomfortable truths. His death did not absolve him. It only deepened the resolve of those seeking justice for his victims. In this conclusion lies a powerful message. While predators like Epstein may believe themselves untouchable, they are not immune to accountability when survivors refuse to be silenced. The fight for justice is long and arduous, but it is worth pursuing, not just for those directly affected, but for society as a whole. As we close this chapter, we are left with both sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the lives shattered by Epstein's actions, but hope that their courage will inspire lasting change. The survivors' voices have transformed tragedy into action, ensuring that while Jeffrey Epstein may have built an empire of abuse, its ruins will serve as a warning and a call to action for generations to come. Years have passed since Jeffrey Epstein's empire of abuse was dismantled, but the echoes of his crimes continue to reverberate. The survivors, once silenced by fear and shame, now stand as symbols of resilience and courage. Their stories, once buried under layers of power and corruption, have become a rallying cry for justice and reform. The world they inhabit today is not the same as the one that allowed Epstein to thrive, and much of that change is owed to their unyielding determination. In the aftermath of Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction and the legal battles against Epstein's estate, many survivors have found ways to rebuild their lives. Some have chosen to step away from the public eye, seeking peace and privacy after years of turmoil. Others have embraced advocacy, using their experiences to fight for systemic change. They speak at conferences, work with nonprofits, and collaborate with lawmakers to create stronger protections for vulnerable populations. Their voices have become a force for good, ensuring that their pain is not in vain. The ripple effects of the Epstein case have reached far beyond his immediate circle. Institutions that once turned a blind eye to his actions have been forced to confront their complicity. Universities that accepted his donations have established programs to support survivors of abuse and fund research into human trafficking. Financial firms that managed his wealth have faced lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny, prompting broader conversations about corporate accountability. The legal system has also undergone significant changes. The 2008 plea deal that allowed Epstein to evade serious consequences became a catalyst for reform. Advocacy groups successfully pushed for legislation aimed at increasing transparency in prosecutorial decisions and strengthening protections for survivors. These reforms are a testament to the power of collective action, a reminder that even Entrenched systems can be challenged when people demand change. For society at large, the Epstein case has become a symbol of reckoning, a moment when the world was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, corruption, and systemic failure. It has sparked broader conversations about how power can be abused and how institutions must be held accountable for enabling predators. Movements like Me Too have gained renewed momentum, inspiring more survivors to come forward and share their stories. But the epilogue of this story is not just about systemic change, it is also about personal healing. For many survivors, the journey toward recovery is ongoing, a process marked by both setbacks and triumphs. They carry the scars of what they endured, but also the strength they found in overcoming it. Their resilience is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for growth, even in the face of unimaginable pain. One survivor, now an advocate for human trafficking awareness, reflects on her journey. What happened to us will never be erased, but we've taken back our power. We've turned our pain into purpose. Her words capture the essence of this epilogue, a story not defined by Jeffrey Epstein's crimes, but by the courage of those who stood against him. As time moves forward, the ruins of Epstein's empire serve as a stark reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. But they also stand as a monument to resilience, a testament to the survivors who refused to be silenced and the advocates who fought alongside them. Their legacy is one of hope. Hope that justice can prevail even in the darkest circumstances, and hope that future generations will inherit a world where such atrocities are no longer tolerated. The final chapter closes with a sense of resolution, but not complacency. The fight against abuse and exploitation is far from over, but it has been irrevocably changed by those who dared to speak out. In their courage lies a lesson for us all, that silence is complicity, and justice begins with listening. And so, while Jeffrey Epstein's empire has crumbled into dust, what remains is something far more enduring, a movement born from pain but fueled by hope, a promise that no predator will ever again wield such unchecked power without consequence. This is where their story ends, but where ours must continue.